Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, welcome back. Right now we just go around the room, introduce ourselves. My name is Prisha.
Jesse. Lee. I'm Brad. I'm Jack.
I'm REA.
They are.
I'm AJ.
Richard.
My name is Jerry.
David.
My name is Clint.
Bob.
Don.
Carly. My name is Mark.
My name is Robert.
I'm Harley.
Ken. I'm Tom.
I'm Prasada Chitta. I'm Joe.
I'm George.
I'm William.
I'm David. Jason.
My name is Brian.
I'm Amos.
I'm Cal.
Peter.
Paul.
My name is Joe.
My name is Richard.
I'm Gary.
My name is Gary.
And I'm Benjamin.
All right, I'll introduce our speaker today, Benjamin, and talk about love before the fire, love before the Benjamin Young began meditation as part of his spiritual practice when he was in his early 20s. Over the last 24 years, he has studied many spiritual paths, pursued a number of meditation practices, led spiritual retreats, and given spiritual talks. Benjamin traveled to India for 2 months in 2001, where he and a close friend took monks' vows. He has been practicing a Buddhist form of meditation called Anapanasati, mindfulness of in and out breath, for the past 20 years and assisting others in developing their spiritual practice.
One correction. I wish it were 24 years, but it's actually 44 years.
40. That's right.
Sometimes it seems much longer, but it seems to be a part of life. What I'd like to do today is to dialogue a bit with you about some of the topics that are important to me and about practice in general, and some different aspects of practice. To begin with, I'd like to start off talking about that base practice, meditation, a bit. And I'd like to know how many people have a regular meditation practice. Could some of you, or would some of you volunteer to describe what that practice is, like how often you meditate, how long you meditate, those kinds of things?
I'm going to say half an hour every morning.
Okay. Every day.
Every day.
Anyone else?
I also meditate half hour every day.
Okay.
Ditto.
Me too.
20 minutes.
Next, go ahead.
Well, between 10 minutes and 20 minutes every day.
Okay. How'd you pick the length of time you meditate? I like nice round numbers.
Suggestion from a teacher 30 years ago.
Okay. You know, the length of time really can vary. It doesn't really have to be fixed. But sometimes it's better to let it run a little longer, and sometimes it's better to cut it off a little shorter. If you feel really distracted or fatigued, sometimes the struggle of just dealing with it impinges on the practice a bit. It tends to set a mindset that we don't really want to be here and we don't want to do this, and that's not necessarily a positive experience. Does anyone have any comments about why they meditate? What's the purpose of the practice?
I meditate in hopes of eventually finding some sort of sanity, because there's so much anxiety in my life lately, or has been up until I started getting serious about meditation again a few months ago. So I just would love to get to a level of just feeling, like I can deal with life a little more autonomously. So that's kind of my basic goal.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I started off meditating just to feel calm and at ease and even out my day, but after several years, it's more about observing the mind and seeing what it's doing and witnessing that, which also has the same balancing effect, but it's more introspective, I guess.
I meditate when I get insomnia and I fall asleep, usually every time I do it.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I find it that it's the one time where I can try not to hold on to any thoughts, because I know that for the rest of the day there will be things that I will stress about or think about or worry about, and this is my one time where I try not to have to think about anything. Of course, thoughts come and go, but where I don't concentrate on anything.
Okay.
I think it's hard to really express, because I feel like meditation is so much outside of the mind in some ways. It's embodied. It's hard to kind of use the ego or the intellect to kind of express it. But I think that for me, I just kind of consistently acquire a certain level of gifts and realizations about the habits of my mind and just being with that has been really revolutionary. And some teachers I've been very disappointed with. Some teachers have been some of the most embodied people I know. And so I think that's been really exciting as well.
I think that meditation is an evolutionary process. I think as you sit with yourself, it changes over time, and certainly we change. It reflects that basic concept that the Buddha presented, which is everything is continually changing. When I started meditating many years ago, I was really desperately seeking something. I felt a lot of pain in my life, and it was an opportunity for me to try to find a way out of that. I think as time has gone by, that's really evolved, and I don't think the pain necessarily just disappears. I think that our perspective about it changes, and one of the impacts of my practice has been that my perspective on what pain is, or suffering, if you want to call it that, changes. I think the other thing that sort of happens is, we were chatting earlier, and one of the words that came out was mind. We use these words, and they really don't have definitions that we all can quite agree on. I mean, mind for one person means one thing, and something totally different for another. For example, if you just look at the scientific view of mind versus the spiritual view of mind, they can be radically different things. So part of the practice for me has been sort of to explore those aspects of myself, which we might call mind, we might call consciousness, we might call spiritual perspective. All these things sort of integrate together, and to try to figure out exactly what aspects of that I am. And it ends up being a very interesting question to sort of look at. I have a writing. It'll take a couple of minutes to read, but I'd like you to listen to this. It's a very famous thing. Most of you probably have already heard it. It's the heart of the Prajnaparamita Sutra. So how many are familiar with that? I encountered it a number of years ago, and I can tell you the first time I heard it, I just absolutely thought it made absolutely no sense to me at all. And I can tell you that after having sat with it for quite a few years, it still doesn't make any sense to me. But one of the nice things about it is that it doesn't make sense. See, part of the problem I have is that I want to make sense out of everything. And sometimes in your life you have to reach the point where you transcend the desire to make sense out of everything. So in a sense, that sort of reflects my meditative process. So here goes. I'm not a great reader, so please forgive me. The Prajnaparamita Sutra isn't really part of the Tripitaka, the original writings of the Buddha. It's a later document that's been through a whole series of iterations, and there are actually a number of different forms of it. The Heart Sutra is considered the concentrated form. It's very short. There's a 20,000 line version of the sutra. There's a 100,000 line version of the sutra, all of which are sort of expansive statements of what the Heart Sutra says. And from a Mahayana standpoint, is everyone familiar with what Mahayana traditions are? There are three major traditions in Buddhist perspective. The Hinayana tradition, which is basically the old way, which is really sort of the orthodox view of Buddhist perspective. The Mahayana, which is a later form, which built on the Hinayana tradition. The Hinayana tradition was basically attaining enlightenment. The Mahayana tradition was attaining enlightenment for all sentient beings. And then the Tibetan tradition, which uses Vajrayana, which is sort of an accelerated pathway to Mahayana, or all sentient beings finding enlightenment. I don't have any particular attachment to any of these perspectives. I think they're all interesting, and I sort of seek out material from all of them. This is from the Mahayana tradition, is really considered one of the base teachings of the Mahayana tradition. And as is typical of sutra forms, this is a conversation involving usually the Buddha or one of the Buddha's disciples. In this case, it's the Buddha transmitting a teaching through a disciple. It says, the humble Lord of Enlightenment is seated at the center of his radiant assembly of monks, nuns, single and married practitioners of perfect wisdom and celestial beings. By the way, Prajnaparamita means perfection of wisdom. Suddenly, Lord Buddha enters the astonishingly profound concentration on Prajnaparamita, in which every single structure of relativity shines clearly and distinctly. This particular concentration is known as the Samadhi of deep light. To the right of the Golden Buddha, the sublime form of Avalokitesvara, embodiment of enlightened compassion, now manifests like a brilliant white cloud shining in the sunlight. Avalokitesvara is also spontaneously engaged in the profound practice of Prajnaparamita, clearly experiencing the insubstantiality and transparency of the five constituents of personal and communal awareness, including material form and conscious states. Sariputra, O sublime Avalokitesvara, as I inquire only through the power of Buddha nature, so may you reply through the same transcendent power. How should a son or daughter of the Buddha family proceed in order to study truly and to practice powerfully the unthinkable depth of perfect wisdom? Avalokitesvara. O noble Shariputra, a beloved son or daughter of the wisdom lineage who longs to awaken to the depth of unthinkability should proceed this way. All material form and all conscious states are to be known as absolutely selfless, without separate identity, luminously pure. The process of personal awareness does not need to be purified. They are ontologically transparent or perfectly pure by their own nature. All the apparently complex forms of functional interdependence remain utterly simple, indivisible, pristine, open, and free. Universal transparency is what manifests as both form and consciousness. Material forms are empty of the slightest substantial self-existence, and luminous emptiness of self-existence is precisely what is manifest as material forms. In the same way, consciousness states are empty of the slightest independent self-existence, and luminous emptiness of self-existence is precisely what is manifest as conscious states. O Shariputra, all structures of relativity without exception are empty of inherent self-existence, free from characteristic marks or limits, never created and therefore never destroyed, transparently pure, untouched by any conventional notion of imperfection, never increasing or diminishing. O Shariputra, in the light of Prajnaparamita, ontological transparency alone reigns, free from substantial material forms and from independently existing conscious states. Interdependency functions harmoniously and unerringly without any need for self-existing form, perception, concentration, or separate awareness of whatever description, without substantial eyes, ears, nose, tongue, nervous system, or mind. The profoundly significant karmic carriers of all the profoundly significant karmic careers of all beloved conscious beings unfold coherently without any need for separate subject or object, without subjective or objective sound, smell, taste, or touch, and without any substantial subjective or objective structures, either particular or general. O Shariputra, reality is never veiled or crystallized by primordial ignorance, and so there is no moment of illumination when veils or constructs are removed and ignorance ceases. There is no time at which total awareness grows older or dies, and so there is no moment of liberation when the function of aging and dying is overcome. There is no substantial need for the drive to attain liberation, for there is no substantial bondage. O Shariputra, in precisely this sense, there is no independent self-existence of what conscious beings conceptually or perpetually project as pervasive suffering. Even the notions developed by contemplative science about the inevitable arising of universal suffering, its ultimate cessation, and the spiritual disciplines conducive to its cessation, even these venerable teachings are relative or conventional. Since there is no separate moment of attaining wisdom, there is no time when perfect wisdom has not been attained. The uncompromising light of Prajnaparamita even reveals that there is never any independently existing perfect wisdom in the first place. O Shariputra, bodhisattvas never generate any awareness of intermediate attainment or of reaching some supreme spiritual goal. They abide in abodelessness, stand their ground within the groundlessness of perfect wisdom. Their entire sensibility or mind stream is free from the slightest obscuration, free from the faintest trace of separate subjects or objects, and free as well from the rude anxiety that arises inevitably for the instinctive notions of objectivity and subjectivity. These fantastic notions and other false assumptions upon which the conventional world claims to be founded simply evaporate in the blazing light of Prajnaparamita. The entire complex of cyclical sorrow become transparent. O Shariputra, the fully awakened Buddha of the beginningless past, the open future and limited dimensions of the perfect present can manifest the total awareness of Buddha nature only by birthless birth from Mother Prajnaparamita, wound of perfect wisdom. O Shariputra, listen carefully to these symbolic sounds which contain the entire perfection of wisdom, as a vast tree of miraculously contained within a small seed. This is the mantra which awakens every conscious stream in pure presence. This is the mantra of all mantras, the mantra which transmits the principle of incomparability and inconceivability, the mantra which instantly dissipates the apparent darkness of egotistic misery, the mantra which invokes the truth and does not acknowledge the separate self-existence of any falsehood. And the mantra is Gate Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhisvaha, which means pure presence is transcending, ever transcending, transcending transcendence, transcending even the transcendence of transcendence. It is total awareness, it is suchness. During the pregnant silence which follows this amazing discourse, the miraculous mantric transmission of full power, perfect wisdom of Lord Buddha comes forth from his blissful absorption and addresses Avalokitesvara, beautifully expressed and impeccably transmitted of sublime celestial bodhisattva. A son or daughter of the Buddha family should enter the unthinkable depth of Prajnaparamita in precisely the way you have indicated. Okay, what do you think?
I'll say the same thing.
It's almost as if someone asked, could you please in words explain the unexplainable? And the response is, oh, you want words? I'll give you words.
Give you words.
Here.
Right. Right. And, part of our culture, the thing about our culture is we really want to understand everything. We really strive, you might say that we are scientific materialists, and it's a good term for it. We try to put everything in the context of how do we grasp it with our mind. And the reality is that what this is saying is that no matter how hard you try, you're not going to grasp this with your mind. You're not going to be able to sit there in a meditative process and come to an understanding about what's happening. You can only experience it because as soon as you attempt to understand what's happening, you've limited your ability to experience it. And that's really the foundation of, at least my perspective, on what a meditative practice is about.
That's a very clear explanation, and I would go as far as to say that what you just said is an understanding, a very simple understanding of the Hubbard Sutra. Anyway, you said at the beginning you didn't understand that.
I don't.
But you clearly do.
It's, again, it's about this definition thing.
Yes.
It's being stuck in the perspective that, we have to know what's going on. So I was wondering, and by the way, I read a lot, and like everything else, through my spiritual history, the reason I read has changed. When I started reading spiritual texts, I did it because I wanted to, first of all, know what it was about, and secondly, learn how to do it. And after I did that for some length of time, I began to recognize that you really couldn't sort of get how to do it by looking at words in a book, because all it did was invoke thoughts in your mind, which is the one thing you're struggling with in a meditative process. So I began to really sort of use books as a way of seeing someone else's perspective on the kinds of experiences I was having. And it became useful in that sense. So I read a lot I don't necessarily grasp, but occasionally things pop up in what I'm reading that tell me, hey, look, this is an experience I had, and I can relate to that because that seems to represent an experience that I've had in my own practice. So that's part of having an assortment of things to look at, or an assortment of people to talk to. By the way, that's what a good teacher will do for you. They'll reflect back. They'll give you insight into their experiences versus your experience. And I stumbled across a really nice book written by a man named B. Alan Wallace. And the book is called Embracing Mind. And for a long time, I've tried to sort of gain perspective into spirituality versus science itself. I spent a lot of time investigating quantum physics just because I had a curiosity about what it was saying about the universe as we perceive it versus spirituality, which I think tends to more reflect about the universe the way it is. So he's trying to reconcile it in the book, and he came up with what he defined as levels of consciousness. And he defined 3 levels. The first he defined as being the psyche. And he said the psyche is dualistic conscious and subconscious mental processes, including the 5 physical senses, arising moment to moment as a coarse mind stream. This is what psychologists study, and the corresponding terms in Buddhism is coarse mind. That's where we live. That's the mental activity that goes on all the time in our lives. We look at things, we think about them, we analyze, we come up with reactions to things. Everything that pretty much constitutes the everyday stream that we live in. He said below that is what he defined as substrate consciousness. And he said, as explained in Buddhism, the subtle mind stream of the individual sentient being maintained throughout all of its incarnations. All of the latent and subconscious phenomena that we commonly attribute to the mind and the senses are said to emerge from the substrate consciousness. So this is an underlying level of consciousness that indeed is present, but is not so specifically me, in the sense of the I-ness that we sense the world through every day. Does that make sense? Yeah. Then he defined one other level of consciousness, which he defined as primordial consciousness. And he said, in Buddhism, the ultimate ground state of consciousness, out of which all appearances emerge and to which they subside. So in a sense, if you look into your mind, the first thing you notice is the psyche, which is the mental activity that goes on. As the mind begins to become more quiet and there's more of an abidance without the self-absorbed view, you tend to, in a sense, experience substrate consciousness. And when there's a universalness, sort of an all-pervasiveness of mind, then, in a sense, that's the primordial consciousness. And you can equate this in the Buddhist tradition of practice to the meditation practice of shamatha practice, where you go through what are called the various jhanic states. And those states descend into, or ascend if you prefer, into this primordial consciousness. So you can actually experience these different levels of consciousness by doing the practice. Problem is you can't sustain them. You can only be there while you're engaged in the practice. So when I sort of took a look at this and said, how does that relate to science? The primordial consciousness was really kind of fascinating because in science we have a principle called a void. You could call it space. And space is basically containing nothingness. I mean, if you have a vacuum, there's not supposed to be anything present in it. But what quantum physics tells you about that vacuum is that spontaneously something can arise. Particles can appear and disappear, even though there's nothing that we're aware of or can detect that is present within that vacuum. And in a sense, I sort of equate that to primordial consciousness, because out of primordial consciousness, everything can arise and does arise, and in the end, everything descends back into it. So that was sort of my correlation between the two. So that sort of represents a foundation for my meditation practice and what I work with in practice. What I'd like to do today is take it a little bit further and talk about some of the other kinds of practices that we can do, which aren't specific meditation practices, but are also related to spiritual practice. And I'm sure everybody engages in lots of other practices besides just the meditative practice. So we're going to talk about a few of those. I'll begin with a practice. When I sit, before I meditate, I usually say a vow. I say what's called the Bodhisattva vow. And is everyone familiar with the Bodhisattva vow? Do you know it?
I can't recite it, but I know it.
Okay. Does anyone know it?
Is it the beings are numberless, I vow to?
Yes. Okay. Beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Yeah. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to transcend them. Spiritual teachings are boundless, I vow to master them. And enlightenment is unsurpassable, I vow to embody it. Right. When I sit and meditate, it's the first thing I do. And I do that as a reminder, not in a sense of the vow means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For me, the first line of the vow really is a statement, and the next 3 lines are really the answer. Beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. How do I liberate them? I find liberation in my own life. Because we're all connected, and my liberation is tied with everyone else's. So it's really looking at the situation of my life and trying to integrate it into a more expansive sense. And that's how I start my practice. So that's a part of my spiritual practice. Taking a vow. I do it every day when I meditate. Sometimes I do it when I'm not meditating, just as a reminder. Okay? Another practice. Who has another practice?
Metta, for me, is one of those powerful practices that I never hear enough about in Western Buddhism. I think it's at least as powerful as all the others.
Well, and in a sense, the Bodhisattva vow is a metta practice. So you're right, yes. And explain what metta practice is.
Wishing all kinds of good things for me, and then eventually branching out to include everyone. And of course, the most challenging one is my neighbor, my next door annoying neighbor. But it's powerful in the sense that it's really shifting things for me too. to feel compassion, like I said, it's not a vow, but to say, may this person be happy and healthy and safe and all these kinds of things. And at first it feels mechanical, but over a period of time it really starts to shift my so-called reality out here in this real world. So I find it very, very helpful, and I try to incorporate it as part of my everyday meditation.
So, in a sense, it helps to diminish your isolation.
Exactly. Because that's where most of our suffering comes from, is we're locked into our sense of being this separate, special victim, basically.
Right. And, we tend to hear metta practice as being something we associate with meditation. But the reality, when you're driving down the highway and somebody does something that bothers you, it's a wonderful opportunity for the practice, and it's not at that point a meditative practice. It's a spiritual practice where you engage in basically letting go of your isolation and separation, and maybe even extending to recognizing that that individual must be going through a lot of stuff if they're so unfocused on what they're doing. There's a lot of distraction happening. I actually did an interesting spiritual practice that nobody would probably consider a spiritual practice. I took a driving course recently, and it was very revealing because it kept pointing to the fact that we allow ourselves to continually be distracted. And meditation is about learning how we continually allow ourselves to be distracted. So, in fact, we engage in the distraction because there's actually a sense of pleasure associated with being distracted. It helps to fortify and reassure us of our existence, of our selfishness. Any other practices? Yeah.
Well, I'm also involved in something called Diamond Heart. There's a lot of overlap with Buddhism, and one of this cinching your arms and legs, which means like you're walking down the street or you're driving, or I'm walking down the street, I'm driving. I guess it's a form of meditation, but it isn't like this half-hour encapsulated on a stop.
Right.
It's like always trying to draw my attention to the present time and watching when I see my attention wander off into various tapes and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with this? People know what this is?
No.
It's a mala, do you know that? And it's used for?
Recitation of mantra or prayer.
Okay. I just read one. Gate gate paragate parasangate bodhisattva is a mantra. So this is a spiritual practice that isn't really, it can be done as part of a meditation practice, but it doesn't have to be. So how would something like mantra repetition support you in developing your spirituality?
I think the way you read this sutra reminded us of that by talking about sort of its symbolic installation of message. So our whole practice is like a kind of curious search for a helpful message. Mm-hmm. And the mantra can be a way of distilling it and reminding ourselves over and over again of that.
It also engages a couple of practices. One is if you do it with a device, you're mentally and physically engaged. So it helps to develop concentration, which is an essential part of a spiritual practice. Harvey and I took monk's vows, as he mentioned earlier, in 2000. January 1st, 2000 to October, I did mantra repetition. I had to use several malas because I did 5 million repetitions in 10 months. And I counted every single one of those. And if I messed up counting, I started over. Not at the beginning, but at the last count that I had. And they say that if you do enough mantra repetition, that rather than you saying the mantra really says you. Because it's there all the time. I mean, it's perpetual. There's not an instant when it's not running in your mind whether you're saying it or not. And I did it when I was meditating. I did it when I was exercising. And what happened for me was I reached a point where when I felt distracted, if I remember the mantra, it automatically brought me back to some focus. So it's a good discipline in the sense that allows you to get out of a lot of the mental activity that we engage in where our minds are running all the time. So right now, for example, I work out at the gym regularly, and I try to maintain my weights at a point where I'm always being stressed. And I'm an old body, so the reality is that if I'm not careful, I injure myself. So in a gym, if you're not concentrating on what you're doing, you're probably going to hurt yourself. So when I notice my mind wandering, I use a mantra. It brings me back to the moment, allows me to focus again on what I'm doing and to continue my physical exercise. Okay? So it's a tool that helps me to strengthen my concentration, which strengthens my meditation. So you can use it anytime. And it produces an amazing state. I mean, if you do it while you're meditating, you find that it tends to produce a very relaxed sense because it's like watching your breath. You're just watching something over and over. And I'm not suggesting that you do it for long periods so they become your primary meditation practice. But you develop the habit that whenever those words come to your mind, the state associated with them come up in your experience. So it's a very useful practice. Okay? Another one.
Well, I just want to piggyback on that one. I went to Nichiren Buddhism meeting recently, and what I found is in doing the chanting in a group of people, you almost lose yourself and you become one big.
Absolutely,
it's fascinating, just how powerful it is.
Yeah, and that's another form. That's chanting. Now, in that tradition, they chant what is effectively a mantra, but if you ever go off to where, for example, we used to go sit with a Buddhist group, a Theravadan group, and the whole ceremony is a chant. And it's very moving because you become very involved with it. You stop thinking about all the distractions that occur in your mind, and there's just the chant running, and you get to have an experience of that. Or in the Hindu tradition, if you go off and sit with a group of people who are singing bhajans, there's no experience like sitting with 2,000 people who are singing the same thing. I mean, it's an overpowering sensation. You just become so engrossed in this that it creates just an amazing force field around you. So those are just experiences that you can have engaging with other people that are also spiritual practices that open you up to not necessarily being so involved in the I-ness, the selfness. Any others?
I do Tonglen practice.
Oh, okay. Yes. Explain.
Tonglen is, for me, a little bit like creating my own mantra on the spot for whatever neurotic stress I'm under at the moment. So on the in-breath, I lean into my emotional distress. On the out-breath, I send a blessing to myself and all other beings. And the phrases change, but I've noticed after doing it for a year that I have some stock phrases. And just like the other mantras, my mind immediately goes to a state of being when I'm saying the mantra.
Perfect. And you can, in a sense, connect Tonglen practice with metta practice. Because the traditional view is that you suck in all the negativity and you in a sense, purify it in yourself and put out all this positive energy. So that becomes a practice of connecting you with everything else.
So I feel guilty and incompetent about not being very effective at doing concentration, meditation, traditional meditation practices, which I try doing regularly every day for 15 years and from time to time after. So two things I've found helpful. One is when I can't sleep at night, I'm wakeful. I've had insomnia for many years, which is much better. The Buddha's suggestion to concentrate on the body is generally effective, and so I concentrate on one body sensation or another, typically areas of mild pain or suffering, but it doesn't seem to matter so much, and then it doesn't work except I discover it's 2 hours later.
Right.
And I've been asleep.
Yeah.
The other one, which I also most typically do then, is reading Buddhist teachings. It's kind of like a Dharma talk. And what seems to happen for me, as best I can tell, it's not the all-purpose cessation of all thoughts and cessation and nirvana, but it's shifting my thoughts of probably best described as greed, aversion, and delusion into some other pattern than the ones that typically arise for me. And that also seems helpful. And I don't know whether to call it a meditative practice or not, but it seems helpful.
Practice. It doesn't have to be categorized. It's just, one of the things I did was, in order to sort of keep my body more limber, I do a lot of stretching. And what I discovered was that if I sit to meditate, let's say I'm going to meditate for 40 minutes, by about the 20th minute, I'm beginning to reach a little bit of stillness. And at that point on, the meditation tends to deepen a bit, which means I'm doing a 20-minute meditation. So what I did was I put 20 minutes to 25 minutes of stretching in front of it. And by the time I finished my stretching, where, by the way, I also watch my breath, I'm ready for a 40-minute sit. And the reality is that it's a very calming and stilling process. If you approach it to allow the body to move, to allow the body to breathe, to allow the body to be there, not necessarily engaging the mind in other kinds of activity, or engaging the mind. Engaging the mind in, I'm going to have a glass of water, thank you. Engaging the mind in what the body's doing. And it becomes very habitual movement. It's one of the great things about yoga, if you do yoga. It's an unbelievable pre-process to meditation. It's a spiritual practice that prepares you for sitting. Thank you. And I'd like to actually mention, since we're getting short of time, I'd like to mention one big area that I think is really very, very important. And that's devotional practices. And I think, there are a lot of devotional practices that Buddhist practitioners engage in. There are lots of devotional practices outside of Buddhism as well. But the key is that there are two words, and Harvey and I were talking about this when we were coming into the city. The first word is commitment, and the second word is devotion. And I'd like to really take a look at those two words to give you a sense of what I'm trying to suggest when I talk about devotional practice. I did a quick lookup of a definition of commitment. It's a commitment is a promise to do or give something, a promise to be loyal to someone or something, the attitude of someone who works very hard to do or support something. And devotion is a feeling of strong love or loyalty, the quality of being devoted, the use of time, money, energy, etc. for a particular purpose. Okay, I think one of the difficulties we have is that frequently when we engage in a practice like meditation, we are making a commitment. And I think that at some point the commitment has to really transcend that and become a devotional practice. In the sense that rather than just saying it's something we're going to do, we begin to put our life into it. We begin to put it into our life. And we can do that in a whole bunch of ways. We can do it just with how we meditate. We can seek out a good friend who we are willing to rely on. We can seek out a teacher where we can establish a devotional relationship. A devotional relationship is really a committed relationship where we have invested faith. And faith is an essential component. And I'm going to qualify that by saying we're not talking about blind faith. We're talking about in our perspective of where we want to be. And that the pathway we're following will get us there. And when you make a commitment of devotion to, say, for example, a teacher. The commitment is one that you're making for yourself. It's not something you're making to someone else. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to let go of your separateness and your isolation and really open up to connecting with and being a part of someone else. That's what a teacher-student relationship is about. A good friend relationship is the same thing, except it's expressed in slightly different ways. But it's still the same thing. It's opening and sharing, connecting. All of this points back to the Prajna Paramita Sutra, which is about recognizing that we tend to view ourselves as isolated, separate individuals, and that everything we set up within that paradigm basically becomes a limiting factor. And that as you explore the various levels of consciousness that we are, we find expansiveness as we alleviate separateness. The more we can connect with this substrate consciousness, primordial consciousness, the vaster the expanse we experience. The interesting thing about concentration that I've learned from my meditative practice is that it's not what we think concentration is about. In the world, when we concentrate, we expend large amounts of energy to stay focused on something. In my meditative practice, concentration is about being in spaciousness, and it requires effort to draw the distractions in. They're peripheral. We can expend the energy to interact with them and to make them become part of our mind stream. But the concentration itself is just a sense of abiding in spaciousness. I think we're nearly out of time. If you have any quick questions, comments.
Yes, my daily meditation mornings become very, part of my life, like breakfast and brush my teeth. But I was thinking about trying to meditate at night. How do you feel about meditating twice a day?
I meditate twice a day. I'm deliberate, continuous about my morning meditation, which means that occasionally I don't sit at night, but I try to meditate twice a day.
And the second time would be before you go to bed or before?
I try to meditate as early as possible in getting up, as close to when I don't want the day's distractions to start impinging. So I try to meditate as close to when I go to bed as possible so that I'm letting go. And middle day meditations can be useful if you find yourself very distracted and they'll help you center. But from from sort of an abidance standpoint, I think they're probably not as productive.
Do you ever use writing or social media or anything like that as part of your meditation?
I write some haiku. But the writing is just a result of my mental states that arise. In other words, they form and I write them down. I don't really sit down to write them. And I don't really write a lot because I find I tend to be dyslexic. It's very difficult for me to do that, to express myself in that particular form. So I think it's useful for some people. I think it'd be a good practice. Diary, for example, can be a wonderful practice.
Sometimes if there's something particular going on, I do collage, and I do it in a way that I'm not very conscious about what I'm picking out in terms of putting it together on the page, but I just, whatever kind of hits me, and then I just move it around on the page and put it together, and, it just happens.
Sounds like a selfless experience.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Just one question.
Sure.
When you say in concentration, and the concentration is on spaciousness, I've had some exposure in terms of tantric, and I didn't know whether deity formation and then dissolution of that is sort of part of that practice.
I think that I've done some visualization work, and I think what happens is the idea is to really manifest yourself as a deity, which radically changes your perspective. There's a sense of increasing spaciousness in that. It's not quite the same thing, but it gives you an idea that we're not what we necessarily think we are. Same thing with the meditation practice. We tend to look at concentration as trying to control the activities of the mind, rather than allowing the mind to settle and to naturally arrive at a state of spaciousness. It's the struggle that really blocks us from having the experience. So yeah, there's some lessons to be learned from it. It's not quite the same thing, at least from my perspective, not quite the same thing. I think we were out of time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Will you be around after? Answer more questions. Okay. All right, thank you everyone. And I forgot to ask for newcomers again. So it's Jesse and Richard. Did anyone else come in later that is new, just so that we can greet you or make you feel welcome? Kenny's our host today. We'll make an announcement.
Kenny, I'm your host today. Brought some chips, strawberries, and brewed some tea for you guys also, so feel free to enjoy them. And I'll be bringing around the Dana bowl, so the suggested donation is $10. If you're new and you want to get on to the mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet right outside here. And the last thing is some of us will gather at around 12:30 to go get lunch together. So if you're interested, please join there in front of the door.
All right, any other announcements?
Hi, I'm Jerry. The GBF retreat, the 24th year, I can't believe 24 years of GBF retreats have been happening. Oh, thanks, Tom. It's September 18th, 19th, and 20th at Vajrapani Institute. We have spaces available. I do have a waiting list if you want a private room or a cabin, but we do have dorm available and camping. So see me outside if you're interested in going.
And there are now some additional printed flights.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Our speaker next week will be David Lewis,
who will be also our facilitator on the retreat.
Cool.
He's going to liberate us. That's an illusion.
And so now, dedication and merit. Do you have something that you would like to do, or do you want to?
You can.
By the power and the truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity, without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.